I'm going to be discussing the theme of abundance in context of the city, right? So normally when we hear the term abundance, it's like the connotation is always positive. But what I am going to also run you through is abundance in the city, which is framed as negative. So before I proceed further, when I also teach, this is my first question to all my students here. So we try and understand what is a city. But also the other more fundamental and more critical question is, I think, what a city means to you. Yeah? So these are two different things. They are not the same thing. So to start off with, this is just something that I picked up from the net, which are synonymous to a city. Yeah? So what is a city? This becomes an entry point for us to understand what constitutes a city. And if you look at it, a large part of it is really the various functionalities of the city and what is tangible or what we can tangibly understand about the city, the physical tangibles of the city. But just to kind of open up the conversation, let me put the second question forward. What does a city mean for you? What does the city mean for you? Apart from this, what? Nightlife, okay. I'm sure many of us will relate to that. Opportunity. Wonderful. Sorry? Hassle-free travel and traffic. Two sides of a coin. What else? Community. Access to good education, good medical facilities. What else? Anything else? Home. Wonderful. Malls, great. What else? Anything? Recreation. And if you think about these things, many of these we do not actually relate it to a rural landscape, right? So that's the binary that we construct in our heads, and that's the binary that actually exists in plan and policy. So every time we think about planning a city, or we think about making a policy for a city, we start with the binary of the rural and the urban and the framing of the urban, right? So there are different ways of framing the urban, and there is a lot of research that is happening on the city. As Karishma rightly said, the 21st century is actually the century of the city, and a large part of this urban growth that we are going to see is going to be in the countries of the global south, and India and China are really leading over there. And therefore we see a lot of scholarship that is actually existing around the city now. It's really burgeoning, around the southern city actually, to be precise. And what you see over here is actually, I've picked it up from a video that I often use in my teaching, where there are two physicists in Santa Fe, in the NASA lab, who are looking at what is a city. And these are two physicists who are looking at it. So essentially the message I'm trying to drive home is that cities are understood and framed differently by different people. Yeah? So there are mechanical systems, they are compared to a brain, they're compared to anthills, they're compared to organisms, and many more. There are things like the energy, they're actually economic systems, they are studied compared to a circulatory system or even metabolism, right? But fundamentally, if we were to take a step back from this, cities is also about landscapes, right? Different landscapes. And this, actually, you may think the first image you will get is that this is more a rural landscape, but this is in the heart of a city that I have been working for a very long time, almost 6 to 7 years now. This is in the heart of the city of Ranchi, right? Where people do practice agriculture, and there are massive agricultural fields, massive from a city's perspective. So there are agricultural fields right in the center of the city where people are practicing agriculture. So almost when we start to understand what exists on the ground, you're almost in a way beginning to break this binary between the urban and the rural. So cities is about landscapes, about sights, about smells, about sounds. And that is something that is very intangible, but that is also the kind of sound, if somebody is saying traffic and the sound we hear, you relate it to a city, right? And these landscapes in themselves are very varied, right? Now, something like this, you wouldn't know whether it is a city or a town. You would have some sort of a confusion in your mind as to where do you, city or a village, where do you actually place it? Typically, what would conjure up this image of a modern city. But city is also about varied lives. Again, this is a photograph from a city. This is not really, of course, you can see a lot of elements that speak to the city, but then lives in themselves are also very varied. Yeah, so it's about lives, it's about landscapes, it's about livelihoods. So in many ways, the point that I'm trying to bring out over here is that cities are sites of strong binaries, right? First, the framing of the city is embedded and anchored within a binary, but they also exhibit very strong binaries, right? And some of that we have already spoken. This I've not put together two images. This actually coexists in a city. So you will find that there is this towering structure, a very modern structure, but next to that you will have a slum. And we see it in all our cities. If you look around, you look out. I remember, I think this was almost a decade ago, I was struck when I was in Chennai. I was staying in the Taj over there. And this was a conference on poverty alleviation. And if I looked out of my window, I actually saw a slum right next to this. It was abutting the Taj property there, right? And this is a very typical site. So cities are about poverty and about wealth. They are about opportunities. I said somebody mentioned over here opportunity, right? But they are also about lack of choices for people who can't avail these opportunities. They are about rich ecosystems that cities showcase. Your lakes in the case of Bangalore, the lakes, the valley systems, all this is an ecosystem that provisions the city, but it's also about the degradation of these ecosystems, right? So you have thriving ecologies, but also how these are constantly getting degraded. There is an abundance of resources in cities, but there is also, again, a lack of access to these resources. And these are the binaries that exist in the city. It is all about individualism, right? I as an individual and how I survive in the city, but it is also about collective experience and energies that come together. Somebody spoke about communities, right? So it's all about collective experience and energies that come together in the city. It's about large infrastructure, but it is also about a complete breakdown of the very basic services, right? You will not have water. A large population in our cities don't have access to water, don't have access to sanitation, simple things like open spaces and solid waste management. These are not services that they are able to access easily. Therefore, cities is all about binaries, and this binary is both the positive binary as well as the negative, right? And I showed you that there is what we think of as the positive binary and what is constructed or framed as the negative binary. Those are the extremes that we see in cities, yeah? But what is, I think, probably more critical to understand is how these negative binaries or negative abundances that we see in a city, how do these get created? How do these get created? What are the drivers that create them? Yeah? And if we actually try to unpack the whole way the city as an organism or as a system comes together, then each one of us here, sitting here and inhabiting this city, is responsible for creating this negative abundance in the city, and this I will make it clear as I move on, right? So basically these binaries, as we have seen, they do coexist on the ground, right? But can they coexist better? That's the question. Can they coexist in a manner that the negative abundances actually start to provision the city as a whole and start to provision its people and its citizens? That's the question we'll try and understand. So this is just the image of a work that we had done. What you see on the left-hand side is a typical, this is a tribal hamlet in the city of Ranchi, and how this then got eaten up by the city as the city expanded, right? And what you see on the right-hand side is what exists today. So that's the Suvarnarekha river that most of these tribal hamlets are located alongside, and then that's where people lived, and these are all the other smaller services that they use. But when we plan the city, and when we look at the city, especially from a modernization lens, right? And this is where I now want to bring in the whole idea of traditional and modern, right? A lot of the negative abundance that we see in the city is largely created through the pursuit of modernization, right? So cities are all about modernization, and it's a modern landscape compared to the traditional landscape that you will see in the rural areas. So what you see here is really your big roads, your built fabric, which is at the edge of the river, whereas when you would earlier, people would never occupy this floodplain of the river. That was largely used for agricultural purposes and other non-built spaces. But as you see, once we are completely removed from what exists on the ground and we plan in a manner that we don't take cognizance of it, we end up fragmenting very self-sustaining, decentralized, self-managed hamlets that people have created over generations. This is what the traditional occupation of land was. What I do want to tell you over here is that it exists in the city of Ranchi even today, although in a very fragmented manner, as you saw it in the previous graphic. So people would live at the highest part, land which is at a higher level, that's where they would live. And as the land slopes towards the river, it was used for agriculture, it was used for different other services, but not for living. And primarily, what did this mean? If we were to take it to today's context, your habitations never got flooded, right? So today when you see cities getting flooded, it's primarily because you have constructed here. Right? You have not respected the ecology, you have not respected our ecosystems, which have been actually provisioning the city. But even as we plan and as the city expands, a lot of these things don't get wiped out. That's the fundamental thing that I'm also trying to drive hard here. They continue to exist. They exist because we create them through plan and policy, and they exist because there is a demand for it, right? It's not that it will stay there when nobody will demand for it. People continue to use these spaces. So on the right-hand side, left-hand side, these are a whole lot of open spaces that that people use and people actually survive on. So for instance, this is the weekly heart that is right next to this particular hamlet that we have shown over here. People grow over there and they come and sell for the city as a whole along the roadside over here. And that's a negative abundance, right? You will see a lot of vending and a lot of informal markets in the cities, and we typically say this is not what we want, this is the negative abundance, but the city needs them. Without this, the city cannot survive, right? So they do coexist. Asarna Sthal is a place where the tribals actually worship nature. In most of the hamlets that we saw, they continue to exist, right? The Dadi, that's a traditional system of water, that it's a small pond that is dug in the floodplain of the river, and they line it with natural materials in such a way that what you get from that is filtered water, and that is used for potable as well as non-potable. Amasna Sthal is where the dead are buried, and the Akhada, that's where a lot of the outdoor activities happen, right? And these, as I'm mapping them, I'm also showing them, showing as to how they exist in the contemporary context. These are all multifunctional open spaces, so many of these spaces get to be used very differently. This is another set of open spaces that is in the city of Dharwad, right in the heart of the city, where there is this sort of a shrine, and there's a tree, and there is a lot of informal development that you see around it. These are again very multifunctional spaces that we see in the city that people are using in myriad ways. If these spaces were not there, or if they had not appropriated these spaces, a lot of the people, there would have been chaos and mayhem in the city. We, as the formal part of the city, would not have been able to live the way we live if these people were, if this section of the society was not using the spaces that they are using in the way that they are using. And there's a fluidity around these spaces. Yeah, this is from Bangalore. This is another exercise that we did where we actually showed from Lalbagh all the way to Kempe Buddhikere. We took this whole stretch and we said what are some of the open spaces that are available here, right? And many of them, if you look at it, these are also what we looked at different kind, public open spaces, institutional open spaces, sacred, underutilized spaces and informal open spaces. We actually mapped them. Yeah? And there is a huge amount of underutilized and informal open spaces which hold the potential, which when visibilized, which when developed can actually provision the entire neighborhood, but also the city at large. Now, many of these are used also in very different ways, right? So they are used differently across the year, they are used differently through the day. So if you look at this, this is the Malavalli village. So this is close to Lalbagh in the same precinct that we had mapped. And if you look at it, there is a seasonal use of inside the temple space where it is used in different ways, but also how the temple in itself is used and the space around it is used very differently through the day. So there is a dynamism around these spaces, but which we don't tend to see and which we often invisibilize as something that is not desirable in the city. This is another one. If you look at this photograph, again, it will typically conjure up the image of a rural landscape, right? But this is again in the heart of a city where wells existed. People are relying on the water from these wells, and it's potable water. These are getting degraded. They are getting ignored and actually falling apart simply because the municipality has said that we will be reaching you piped water supply. So when there is a centralized piped water supply, what we tend to do is actually the decentralized systems tend to fall apart. But given that many of these services, especially for the slums, will reach towards the end, there is actually a time when most of these residents do not have access to what I showed earlier, even the most basic services. So we did work with communities to actually restore and repair some of these wells, and this has been now 4 years. We are monitoring both the quality and quantity of water, and there has been a positive increase in both. So in a way, the idea is to see how can we this negative abundance and positive abundance, or these binaries, how do we make them work for each other? So in this particular, for example, we looked at only these 4 wells that we repaired and restored, but we also mapped the wells within 500 meters of the intervention wells, and over a period of time we saw that the groundwater had increased and there was a positive benefit for the larger settlement as a whole. Yeah. This is again agricultural practices right in the heart of the city again. How the livelihoods are linked to it and how this is very much needed. Now, I will just take a slight diversion here to show, for example, this is in Dharwad, right? The Gwala Gali or the Gauli Gali. It is right in the center of the city. And what we found over here is that there is a huge community of people who are rearing cows and who are supplying milk to the city. All of us are using these products and we use them on a daily basis, right? Now, Gauli Gali is located here and it still continues to exist. But earlier, most of the cows were taken to a tank which was close by called Amikere. And most of the cows were taken there for their water and their fodder. But what you see over here, this is what Amikere looks like today, right? So it's been filled up. There is all kind of different government offices that are located over there. But people from Gauli Gali continue to do what they have done for generations, that is rear cows, produce milk and sell that milk for the city. But those cows do need the water and the fodder. So what do? They go to a lake which is located on the outside of the city, almost 4 kilometers away. In the morning, all these herders take their cows there and then they get back in the evening. So the economy continues to exist, but it is now, we are constantly in the pursuit of modernization. We are pushing it to the periphery of the city, not planning for it, not working around it to make it a positive abundance. What it manifests is really as slum settlements, informal settlements, things that are eyesores for the city. But if we look deeper, it's something that we are all consuming, and it exists because there is a demand for it. So we create it, but it also persists because there's a demand for it, right? This is another one. If you look at the map here, this is in the city of Ranchi. Heart of Ranchi, you have this sort of badis, what they call agricultural fields, where they are rearing, where they are actually growing vegetables, and those are sold in the market which is close to the city. Now, essentially, the message that I'm trying to give over here is that a lot of these abundances or binaries, as we would want to say, these coexist, right? But they coexist actually not in a manner that they can be integrated together in the city. Rather, they are framed, one is looked upon as, the modern part of the city is looked upon as desirable, and the not so modern part, or something that has traditionally been there but has changed or morphed over the years into eyesores, what we call eyesores, also continues to exist, and they provision the city, but we do not plan for them. So the idea is to see how we can rewire interlinkages across these binaries. So we have started to do a little bit of that, and I gave you some examples of it, but we also need to work a lot more on how some of these can be integrated. Just to conclude, in this current context of climate change, where we are constantly speaking about the greenhouse gas emissions, things like agricultural production, things like milk production, which is happening in the heart of the city, to be able to retain them and to be able to let them coexist with the city or within the city is the way forward, because that's where you are actually bringing in food security, you're bringing in water security, you're bringing in all sorts of other elements, keeping them secure within the city such that they provision people and the citizens of that and the city as a whole. The idea is to see how not to make these binaries, how not to construct these binaries, and to see how to integrate these binaries. So to conclude, this is my last slide. This is really about rewiring the interlinkages across binaries. And if you see this slide, on a lighter note, this is a slum in the city of Bhopal, which is located on the land of the BHEL. And they all have coolers. Many of them also have ACs, and this is the wires that they are pulling from informally from the BHEL campus, right? So essentially, all of these are just coexisting. It's illegal electricity that they're pulling and running their lives. Why one might as well recognize this and say we need to provision it, and we need to actually plan and provide for it. Thank you very much.